Welcome to the Critical Media Studies Podcast. We're your hosts, Mike Rapici
and Barry Falk.
Dr. Michael, how are you this evening?
Dr. Barry, I'm well, sir. How are you?
Are you with me on the Zoom? Yes, you are.
Yeah,
yes,
we're here. Things are good.
We're here for part two of a discussion of Bernard Steigler's What Makes Life Worth Living, a pharmacology. And we're here, I guess, for a repeat. We're going back to the subject of the pharmakon and pharmacology one more time and looking at a particular chapter from the book. So we're dipping into the Steigler book that we discussed in the previous podcasts and getting a little bit more of a taste. And tonight we're going to talk about chapter 3 of Steigler's 2013 book.
Slightly different plan for this evening, though. In the past, we've gone more through, I feel like the plan has been to sort of outline the arguments and to work through the thinking behind the arguments. And tonight, I think we're doing something a little different. I think tonight, the plan is to lay out the arguments and just talk around them.
Yeah, with an idea of hopefully in sort of approaching it sideways, we're going to end up clarifying a couple terms that he uses, the pharmakon,
right?
But also two other terms that he uses a lot in this chapter, right? Proletarianization and intoxication and disintoxication.
Right.
And so we're not, as Michael said, we're not going to do a summary of the chapter so much.
No, I don't. I don't feel like we're wedded to the text tonight. This should, if all goes well, this is just a conversation among or between two occasionally cranky guys. And that can be that.
Well, no, I think I want to say that we have more content than that. It's not just going to be crank. We're going to talk about Steigler's terminology. And by talking about it and around it, like you were saying, I think we're going to hopefully illuminate some of his concepts and make his concepts hopefully a little bit more user-friendly for ourselves and also for you, dear listener.
I bring that. I wanted to start with that just because I want to make it clear. This was a very frustrating chapter.
Well, it's Steiglerese to the max.
It was. And so I think that my personal agenda here is it's twofold. It's trying to clarify the stuff that's interesting and then to sort of test drive it a little bit to see how it works.
Well put. Good metaphor.
And so I guess all I meant by what has now become a very long-winded aside was just to say I don't this text, to try and read sections of this text and then discuss would be a fool's errand. This is just not the kind of the passages in here do not lend themselves to what's the word I'm looking for? Just to being read aloud.
Well, close reading.
Yeah.
Close reading and analysis. Nonetheless,
let's do
when you're done. Unless you had more to say, I'm going to contradict what we've just said by opening with a close reading of it's not necessarily a close reading, but I'm just going to read the opening section, which is pretty lucid, I think. And we're going to talk about it and use this opening example as a way into the intricacies of the chapter. So let me do that. All right. So I'm going to read some bits. And Michael, we didn't rehearse this, so I'm just going to read. But I think you have to, what's the word? You have to interrupt me.
Interject.
If you you had a better word than interrupt. What was your word?
No, well, let's just talk about it. Let's go.
Yeah. Well, just a sense I'm just going to read straight, not comment on it. But if you see something that you want to comment on, I got a few opinions.
I'm ready.
Okay. You're ready. All right. So Beginning, Pharmacology of Nuclear Fire. Bernard Stiegler studied with Jacques Derrida, and Derrida makes many appearances in this chapter. We're going to try to avoid talking too much about Derrida, because in this chapter, Stiegler gets pretty much in the weeds of Derridian philosophy and deconstruction, and we're going to try to we'll try and tread lightly on the Derridian category on territory. That said, this opening example, where Stiegler references not just Derrida but another theorist, Paul Virilio, I think it sort of nicely sets out the claims of the chapter and kind of articulates what's at stake, not just for the chapter, but in the whole book. So let's begin with that. And another thing we like about this, he's historicizing. So we're going to get a little bit of historical context or content in order to understand the pharmakon. He begins basically with the Cold War moment, or maybe not the Cold War moment, maybe just the moment of the Oppenheimer moment, the fact that you have the atom bomb, and then very soon after that, the race for the atom bomb. I'll begin reading. With the military infrastructure, okay, start here. In the context of that, the question appears of what Derrida ventured to call the absolute pharmakon, that of the atomic era, that is, of an age structurally turned toward the possibility of its nuclear auto-apocalypse. So that's the historical marker that Stiegler chooses following Derrida to begin the chapter with. I'll continue reading. With a military infrastructure devoted to the unleashing of nuclear fire, constituted by missile pads, output terminals of digital computer networks, for which the inputs are the radars and other strategic surveillance apparatus guided by calculation systems, synthesizing, this is important, the functions of understanding, themselves connected to the network of networks, the architecture of which lies at the origin of the internet. The question of the pharmakon become pure automaton. Moreover, skip a little bit, the industrial pharmacological age is essentially that of automation. So let me skip a little bit. A threshold was clearly crossed with the advent of nuclear weapons, eventually resulting in the structural proletarianization. Note that word. We'll talk about that word a little bit later. Resulting in the structural proletarianization of the politico-military commander-in-chief himself, and with him, the sphere of politics as such, eventually resulting in the liquidation of the political body and of the regime of psychic and collective individuation specific to it, through the destruction of political knowledge, to which the telecratic becoming of democracy, I think a quick way of glossing and maybe a more easily understandable way of explaining the phrase that Stiegler uses, the telecratic becoming of democracy. He's talking about the fact that, television democracy, the McLuhan-esque, the McLuhan world of the, TV democracy, mass media democracy, mass media broadcast of politics, to which the telecratic becoming of democracy also leads. I'll skip the Virilio, actually, and go to the next paragraph and stop reading. Right. And then we'll go back and gloss it. Beginning with the simulation systems for the radar missile systems of both East and West, however, these technologies that were military in origin rapidly migrated toward management, then toward markets and the most everyday social practices as real-time interactive systems, firstly in the spheres of the stock market, entertainment, and banking, and eventually becoming practically ubiquitous. So I'll stop there and let's see if we can gloss. I said this passage was
Let me
relatively
stop
easy
you
to
1 second,
understand.
actually, because
Oh,
I
you
think
want to
it's
add
important. I
more?
want to add just the last line.
Do it.
I wish
Do
you had
it.
gone one more line. He
We'll
says,
do it. Do it.
eventually becoming practically ubiquitous. This was especially so with the development of the digital networks, beginning with the ARPANET, which became the internet, weaving the fabric that is now the World Wide Web, a new pharmacological milieu, if ever there was one, and as a result of which carbon time gave way to light time. I think it's
Thank you
important
for
because
feedback.
in
Okay.
terms of context, what
Yeah.
he's done
Yeah.
is he has connected what he calls the industrial pharmakon, right? Which,
Right.
and we'll talk about what and why in a second, which is automated. And he traces it straight through now to the
To the
internet.
atomic age, and then from the atomic age to the internet
Right.
age.
So this is a timeline, but not well. Yeah, maybe that's actually the right word for it. These are plots on a line that say
He's
we've got
giving us historical markers. I think that's one of the reasons why this is a helpful passage, because
right.
he's giving us a timeline, historical markers, and he's making us think of all these things that they're connected with technology, but we don't necessarily think of their structural similarity. And he's arguing for their deep,
Interconnectedness.
deep interconnected.
So here's my question for you about this, right? When we talk, and we talked about this last time, but when we talk about the pharmakon, what we're looking at, right, is the structures. And this was the big takeaway for me last time, right? Is that the
Right,
pharmakon
right.
is less a thing than it is maybe a structure or a network of things, which is what makes this these connected, what's the word I want? Institutions,
Mm.
more important to see that way. So the move here, the pharmakon, are these institutions, right? Which great positive, great promise, great
Danger.
poison.
By the
Okay.
time you get to the nuclear criticism, that's Derrida's term, the nuclear criticism moment, where um, you have the possibility of Stiegler's word, auto destruction.
Yes. So I have a
Okay, as
question
soon
for
as
you.
you have the pharmakon, you have the possibility of the pharmakon wiping everything out
Everything out.
immediately.
And
Right.
what better place to start with this than nuclear weapons, right?
Exactly.
So there's one thing. He starts the chapter off with the following sentence. Knowledge is always constituted in a pharmacological après coup. And as this après coup, it consists, or excuse me, it constitutes a deferred time of the pharmakon and opens the play of its difference. And there's our Derrida for the moment. But
Derrida, right.
here's my question for you, right? As a pharmakon, we look at what he's called the industrial pharmakon, right? So this is all of the guidance systems and radar and everything that come together to basically allow us to blow stuff up on a massive, massive scale with a frightening level of accuracy.
Indeed.
And this is pharmacological in and of itself, right? It is power, it is control, it is destruction. Okay. And he charts this down through and so you see sort of the industrial weaving and I guess what would be sort of the pre-stages of big data in the way that the pharmacon works and how it gets to us with the internet. And this is not a new argument.
No,
The
yeah, he's relying
interesting
on histories,
so
right? Yeah.
here's my question now that we've laid that out, right? This idea of après coup was new to me, right? This what was the term that the shoot the afterwardness, right? This idea that we have a time to sort of reflect or understand after the fact.
Mhm, mhm.
And he ends this discussion of the
Hold your
pharmacal.
thought. Hold your thought. Hold your thought.
Yeah,
You're on something really important, but I do want to insert just one thing.
yeah,
I do think that that the time of reflection that happens after the event, I think it's important to say that time that we may not use, that one of the tragedies, right, or of human existence is just because we have that time, according to Steigler.
Doesn't mean we use it.
Okay.
Well,
I
and this
just
was
wanted
so
to insert that. I wanted to
you've
insert
no
that.
you've but that anticipates my question. Okay, is that when he begins this this historical sort of formulation of the industrial pharmakon, he moves sort of from analog to digital instruments. And we end, this is why I think it's important. He says we end on the internet and we've moved from carbon time to light time.
I'm
And
right.
so we
Where
now
everything
have,
is happening instantaneously, so therefore we don't think about it.
well, we don't think about it, but I think there's two ways of seeing this, and this is my
Okay.
question for you.
All right. Yes.
There's I don't think about it because I'm going to choose to think about something else or alternately nothing at all, right? So this notion of understanding and attention,
Mhm.
or, and I think this is one of the arguments that really gets developed throughout the chapter that I found interesting,
Hmm.
this idea that as this industrial pharmacon, as these industrial pharmacons gain strength, they gain speed.
Indeed, indeed, indeed.
And
That's
our
definitely the argument.
ability, our
Yeah.
inclination to be thoughtful
Mhm.
now has a new there's a new calculus around this where it's not just our inclination, but our actual ability, if we are so inclined, also becomes a point of consideration. Because as a lot of the thinkers that we've talked about, right? I mean, everybody from Steigler to Hahn to Simone Weil, this idea of attention and stepping away and focusing. If we look at this pharmacologically,
Mhm.
that seems to be something that is increasingly
Harder to do, more difficult.
harder to do. And I wonder if we're at a point now where it's even feasibly possible to get a big picture.
Oh, wow. So what am I supposed to do with this? I'm supposed to answer this?
You solve the riddle, Barry.
I'm going to solve the riddle of the Sphinx. I'm not going to be able to do that, but I have two.
That to me, let me maybe
Yeah, sure.
that to me
Sure.
seems to be not necessarily the question he's trying to answer here,
Mhm.
but the subject matter that he's poking at.
Oh,
This
I absolutely agreed.
and I think it's
Absolutely.
interesting because we've talked about all of these things separately,
Mhm.
and this, despite the fact that I just cannot stand the way that this chapter is written, this is a really interesting way of bringing these things together by historicizing the pharmacon.
Oh yeah, yeah. I think we talked a lot in our pre-game show, or pre-show game. I don't know what to call it. We talked a lot about the beginning of it, but I think that's why. I mean, I think the historical kernel, the ways he brings together these various pharmacons, it's really interesting. I I wanted to make a comment. I wanted to make a comment though. I love the way you were sort of walking through his answer and sort of saying and noticing, and I very much agree with what you noticed, that in a way, the danger posed by the pharmacon increases as the time of response becomes shorter and shorter, and maybe attention spans get shorter and shorter in the progress of pharmaca, whatever, pharmacons, I guess you would say,
Mm-hmm.
that that he gives us. I wanted to maybe comment on your phrase, a phrase you use. You used an interesting phrase when you were sort of taking us through this, Michael. And I wanted to make a comment and see if you have a comment on my comment. So here's the phrase that you used that I thought was really interesting. You were noticing that as the pharmaca connectedly evolve or develop. Really, the progress, I mean, maybe I said it poorly there. Let me see if I can say more clearly. The historical context he gives is basically a kind of spreading of pharmacological thinking or
Mhm.
institutions from the military realm into everywhere in everyday life,
Yes.
right? Really, that's the spread we're talking about. And you noted that the time of response, the time for collective response or individual response seems to be shortening. And then but you also said that most of the thinkers, including Stiegler, who talk about attention, who find in the middle of technology that we need to cultivate mental attention mental practices to facilitate
Spaces.
care, spaces of care. Um, Stiegler is definitely one of those thinkers, but I think I thought of this as maybe a way of differentiating. And I think this will hopefully clarify a difference between Stiegler and some of these other thinkers like Hahn, and maybe the project of this particular chapter as well. That Stiegler, while he's interested obviously in reflection and spaces for reflection, and he's interested in, he wants he wants to be able to attend to reflection in the midst of pharmaca that you know distract us or basically stultify our thinking practices or thinking processes and collective engagements with the pharmakon. He wants to stop it. But I think one difference between Stiegler and everyone else, and this has to do with his particular theory of the pharmakon, and this is a lot of what he talks about in this particular chapter, pointing using and referring to Jacques Derrida, but also Immanuel Kant and Edmund Husserl, and saying that, stepping outside of the pharmakon is not allowed. That, we are looking for an alternative space. We're looking for an alternative practice, but we're not looking to get outside. That's what I understand Stiegler to be saying in this book and elsewhere. And also, I think it's a difference between him, perhaps. Certainly, it's a difference between him, according to Stiegler, a difference between his position and Derrida's position and Immanuel Kant's position. But it might be a difference between everybody else we usually talk about and invoke when we talk about cultivating practices of attention and care in space in the middle of digital stimulation or overstimulation. What do you think about that?
I'm I think maybe a lot, but I don't know. Um, can you, the question seems to be, if I understand you correctly, the question is, can we step outside?
I think Stiegler feels we can't. Oh yeah, well, let me clarify. I
Yeah.
think the thrust of Stiegler is that you don't step outside, and that an analysis of the situation, uh, the purpose of analyzing the situation is not to get outside of it. The purpose of, and maybe we could talk about it. So, what is the purpose of analysis if you don't want to end the pharmakon,
Well,
if you
I
don't want to
think
step outside the pharmakon?
so. I think there's
Because
a
that's what
couple,
he wants, I think.
right. And so this question of analysis or critique
Critique, right?
is an interesting one, right? So to look at it a couple different ways, and maybe this isn't exactly where you were going, but I'm fairly confident this is going to, if not address it head on, it's going to circle around and bump
I
back into
bet
the
it will.
question.
Go for it.
It's not so much that we're not allowed or not able to step out of the pharmakon or to avoid the pharmakon.
Mhm.
Again, I had this moment last time where I was suddenly like, oh, this idea makes a lot more sense if you look at it both as an institutional idea, but also as a networked institutional or a set of networked institutional ideas, right? So the pharmakon is both a thing and a concept in a way. It's practice, right? Praxis.
Indeed, indeed.
And so
And
now,
maybe that directly answers what I was saying.
so the
If you have
question,
a practice, you don't step outside, right?
no, but see, I think here's the thing. I think if we're just going to get hyper literal about this and say, yeah, you could go off the grid and live out in a tree somewhere, right? But the problem is doing that then removes you from it.
Right.
And
Right.
any sort of commentary that you have is just between you and the squirrels. I mean, it's not commentary becomes monologic in that sense, and it's
That's it.
useless,
And he doesn't want that.
right? And the second that you engage in commentary, you are now back in as a part of the pharmakon. So then the question is like, well, what's the purpose of commentary? What are we trying to do? And I've been thinking about this, and it's like, on one hand, I think we can say, well, this is sort of one of those take care moments. Look, we have an incredible amount of power, and this power can be used to provide light and heat and wonderful things to millions of people. It can also end civilization. This is the problem. So we need to take care with this. And the response time is diminished and is sort of, exponentially diminished with every advancement. Ergo, we must take even more care to make sure that we're doing what we're doing. But I think it's also, in a way, sort of scorekeeping, right? Like, what is happening? And the question that so I'm going to come back at this with a question again, which is sort of cheating. I'm sorry, but I think that the answer to the question of what is the purpose of critique is rooted in a different question, which is really, are we optimists or are we pessimists here? Okay. If we have the pharmakon, which is providing, the promise and the poison and the cure, right? Which one is leading the charge? Are we needing cures because the poisons are so great that we're trying to chase after poisons with cures? Or is it a more favorable outcome where, hey, we have this thing which solves world problems, but it created a sort of tangential issue which does need to be
Wow.
addressed? And
Wow.
so I think the purpose of critique really, in a way, depends on your view there.
Well, wow. I'd like to comment on that.
Yeah, no, I'm hoping that's it.
Yeah, I'd like to comment on that because that's a really interesting reading. And I have two things to say about it. So the first thing I want to say is I think Steigler's idea or ideal is to talk about his ideal moment or his ideal version of his argument, I think, would avoid both terms, would avoid optimism and pessimism,
Certainly.
and would simply and would say, what he's after is neither optimism or pessimism. What he's after is a description of the pharmakon. It's a doubled phenomenon or institutional space, as you're referring to it. And so therefore, the language of critique, whether in the name of pessimism or optimism, these are not wrong, but clumsier ways of addressing the issue. Okay, that's the first thing I want to say, but I want to say the second thing, and it's particularly prompted by this chapter, the passage that I had read, but also the end of the chapter, which we'll turn to. I think that maybe, whether he wants to or not, I feel that you delineated very nicely My feeling is that Steigler, despite himself, in other words, despite himself, he presents us a picture of the pharmakon of 20th century, of the industrial and the digital pharmakon. It's mostly when he gets into the weeds, as soon as he gives us details, it really seems like the latter. It really seems like we get more and more poison
So
closer we get to the 21st century.
let
So that the poison, so that it seems to be unequivocally. Now, see, you see, I don't know if I'm making myself clear. I don't think Steigler wants to do this because I think his ideal of his critique of a critique is that he doesn't want to do this. But I think, with his examples, what we get is a lot of poison in the pharmacons, a lot of poison.
let me take a shot at this real quick because I think this is an interesting bridge to another set of ideas. I agree with you 100%. He, I think, wants to look at this idea of the pharmakon as objectively as possible.
Indeed.
However, he's also doing theory here. He's outside. He's not looking at a pharmakon. He's looking at pharmakology. He's looking at the way that this concept functions. And so he's able to distance himself. But the interesting thing about this, and I think this is why I'm inclined to agree with you about the poison being more potent than the cure, which then becomes sort of this perpetual, then the idea of the pharmacon becomes a perpetual motion machine until we blow up, right?
Absolutely.
Is that because
Or we're
what is the
always dealing with poison, the reaction time, the
that's it.
space
It's
that
time.
we're always dealing with poison though.
Yes, because well, the thing is though, right? How do you manage this? What would constitute an effective critique
Okay.
that might lessen the severity or the potency of the poison?
Mhm.
And that is time, right? That is the ability to reflect. And he says as much as this at the end, right? Like this whole question that he's dealing with is like, what makes life worth living? Like, why do this? Right. And the answer is, well, we need people to sort of figure it out for us. Like we need somebody who can, we need a new relationship to the pharmacon. Why? Because it's getting too fast for us. Okay. And okay, once you achieve this new relationship to the pharmacon, what does it look like?
Mhm.
Well, it looks like one that has time, or it's going to be done by people or thinkers who have found a way to exist in relation to these pharmaca such that they can exist in these transitional spaces and create meaningful critiques that will then show us the ways that life is worth living and that things can be good. It does seem to me, though, that
Mhm.
if that is your question,
Mhm.
you're asking that question because you don't have the answer to that question and you need the answer to that question, which would lead me to then, right? We're just following these breadcrumbs here, would lead me to then think that, yes, we're chasing after cures for the poison that are getting increasingly problematic, which is really another way of saying that this move from carbon time to light time
Mhm.
is part of the problem.
Mhm.
We don't have time to reflect. There's no, and each time that we have sort of a pharmacological evolution, the problem is intensified. And the faster that things go, right, the more intensely that this problem is exacerbated, essentially, is I think what he calls intoxication. And so we talked about this at the beginning, right? Like the need to de-intoxicate ourselves. And so um the reading here gets a little buggy and boggy and wordy. I'm going to sort of jump through this quickly, but I do want your thoughts on how we see
Sure.
this happening, right? So
So just to be clear to listeners, we moved from the beginning of the chapter and that example, the
yeah,
historicized
this is
examples.
we're now
Now
dealing with the end of
we're
Stigler's argument.
accelerating to the end. All right.
Because do we have another choice but to accelerate to the end?
No, we have no choice.
Okay,
Yeah.
so he says, Today, we all know that non-inhuman kind in its totality, composed of pharmacological beings, that is, potentially inhuman beings, must disintoxicate itself. Consider the struggle to ban smoking in enclosed public spaces, the removal of asbestos from buildings, a material that until recently was systematically used in construction, the establishment of new regimes of healthy eating in order to struggle against that
All
pathology that
these are
is
ways of struggling against. Yeah.
right. So he jumps down. The true question is the colossal attentional disequilibrium affecting infantile psychic systems and the technological and pharmacological stupidity produced by systems for capturing psychopower and by the situation of generalized proletarianization, which spreads and generalizes a state of systemic stupidity. Let's stop there for a second and let's
Sure.
address this question of proletarianization and where that comes from.
Sure. I'm going to focus. I'm looking here at the page 55, which is near the end of the chapter 3. I'm going to gloss one or two of the terms or that you read and in an attempt to sort of answer your question and clarify things for myself and for you and for hopefully for our listeners and everyone. Okay. I noticed when you read that first, there's a lot of things going on in the very first sentence you read, Michael. Today, we all know that non-inhuman kind in its totality, composed of pharmacological beings, that is, and here, so how interesting. His definition of human beings, if human beings are pharmacological beings, what does that mean? That means they are potentially inhuman, potentially, and that the most, I notice his reluctance to say there's the pharmakon. We are pharmacological beings, and so therefore we're human. He doesn't say that. He says he tries to redefine humanity as the same kind of binary or opposition, contradiction that the pharmakon is. Poison,
Let
cure.
me ask you a question. And
Yeah.
this, I hope that this isn't like just a philosophical landmine here.
Hmm.
But what if we are non-inhuman kind,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
That's different than saying humankind. Like what are we non-inhuman
Which
because we
means
have
we have
not yet,
potential to be human.
but we
That's what I
also
read it.
therefore have a potential to be something other. Is this
Could
the
be
pharmaco
monsters.
is what's
Yes,
that?
that's the pharma, which could be a monster.
Right. So the
Yeah,
pharmacon, the poison of the pharmacon then is a potentially dehumanizing effect.
indeed.
And that dehumanization, am I fair to then say that the dehumanizing effect is one that leaves us thoughtless? It
Indeed,
leaves
indeed. And no, that's exactly it. I just was noticing the ways in which he very interestingly tries to sort of push against standard definitions of the human by introducing the concept of the pharmacon. And I think that's what you were doing right there when you were saying about like, well, what does that mean? That might mean that the poison, your poison or your non-thinkingness keeps you within the non-human. Okay, I'm getting garbly,
you're you're
gunky
you're
goop
you're
here.
you're
But
getting very Steigler fluent
yeah,
here.
I'm getting Steigler fluid and I'm not making any sense. But I think the core of this is a pretty simple idea, but interesting, or rather it's a complex idea, but it's not that hard to grasp. And it's an interesting one. It's this idea that to think of humanity as a pharmacological being means that you're going to have to think about the ratio of humanity and inhumanity differently.
This then, I think, really just reinforces the idea of the pharmacon as a system of
Indeed.
relations.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So that was the first thing I wanted to gloss. Now, getting closer to your question about intoxication, I'm also going to return to the text.
Well,
Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
well, I
Go
think
on
the
with you.
term that the term that's going to
Oh,
make sense
oh,
here is
proletarianization.
proletarianism.
Okay.
Proletarianization.
Okay. So I'm going to,
So
um,
this is a verb.
yes, it is. Yes, it is. I'm going to and I'm going to, like I did with, I returned to the first sentence you read. Now I'm going to return to a bit of, I think, that last
The
sentence you read.
last, yeah.
Of course, that last sentence you read is a paragraph long. Oh my God. But anyway, I'm going to return to a portion of that
Just
last.
want to say, I read this sentence to my wife yesterday in so much frustration. I'm like, how is this a single sentence? But
But I'm only going to talk about a part of the part. So here, so toward your question. But the true question, the true danger, is the colossal attentional disequilibrium that constitutes new pharmakon, and the situation of generalized proletarianization. Okay. Now, Michael, I would say that the best way of defining what he means by proletarianization and generalized proletarianization is somewhat covered, somewhat explained or glossed by the last phrase of the sentence, last part, the final part of the sentence, which I'll read, reread. Generalized proletarianization is, quote, a state of systemic stupidity that becomes the law of drive-based capitalism and industrial populism. So now to define your term, to answer your question and define the term, I'm going to put three things together. Proletarianization seems to be the same thing as becoming stupid. The process, the verb of proletarianization means a kind of dispossession, but in this case, it's a dispossession of knowledge, of wisdom, even. It is the entry of the human into a state of generalized stupidity. That comes, let me say one more thing, because it directly uses a word you used. How do you define even more clearly? What's an even more specific example of if generalized stupidity is an example or helps define proletarianization, what's a perfect example? What's the best example of generalized stupidity? It's the inability to pay attention or to give care, to be thoughtful.
so,
Literally that.
right. I want to connect this back. And this makes sense because this is the end of his argument. And you go back to the beginning of this, right? If we tie this back to automation, right? And we also tie the acceleration of the pharmakon to automation,
Indeed,
right?
indeed.
What we have is stupidity as not just a lack of knowledge, which we don't need anymore because we have machines to think
To do it.
for us.
Well, and that's the cause of the state
But
of
yes, that's the cause. But also because we no longer have but we don't use what would one would assume would be now free time
that's very
because that's
get it.
filled because everything has been automated and things move
Right.
so rapidly. So what you end up with, it's funny. You had asked, what is the example of this? And my my initial thought was Homer Simpson sitting there with his button and a crayon lodged up his nose.
Right.
Right? Like this is my job harnessing the immense power of this nuclear plant is to push a button. Right? Because everything is automated. I no longer have to know
Right.
what's going on and why and how. The technological know-how is not my problem. It's handled by machines, right? And I don't have time to reflect on it because I'm too distracted by everything else.
Shout out while you're using that wonderful example, shout out to any of our listeners who care about Simone Weil. We don't have time to talk about it in this episode, but basically, Simone Weil is quoted and elaborated with great effect by Steigler in this particular chapter. So,
And she's got a similar relation to the factory.
absolutely,
Yes.
absolutely.
So, the end of this is really difficult reading. And so I just sort of want to give you my take on his end. We can discuss it and we can wrap this up. Basically, what he's so I want to say this. He begins his last offering by saying, this irreducibly pharmacological being, that's you, that's me, that's us, right?
That's us, right?
Will never be rid of the threat that is constituted by every pharmakon, and that is symbolized by fire as both technics and desire. And
Going
that's
back to the opening chapter we
right.
discussed the last
So
episode.
basically what he's saying here, and I want your take on this. He's saying, look, we need a new relation to pharmaca because the threat's not going away. And he calls that, right, disintoxication, right? That we've become intoxicated and we need to be disintoxicated. So the new process of spreading disintoxication has to be aimed at our ordinary everyday capacity to discernment of the extraordinary, who can therefore create transitional spaces and who can learn and figure out how life is worth living. In other words, the only way to detox is to somehow get our critical thinking faculties back to create spaces for thought. And then
Within the pharmacon.
within the pharmacon, right? Well,
In the
because as
pharmacon.
we talked about earlier, right? Like you can't get out.
Within
So
it.
he's
Right.
basically saying, hey, and I don't know, like, tell me if I'm wrong here, but this feels like a bit of a cop out. Like, well, how do we fix this problem? Okay, well, we need time and space to think to figure it out. That's an obvious answer, but there's no roadmap for
You
how to
know,
get there.
Michael, and this will be my closing. Well, first off, thank you for that summary of the ultimate gesture in the chapter, because
Yeah.
that was very helpful. You know, here's my parting thought. I'm going to rush to Stiegler's defense, or I don't know if I'm rushing to Stiegler's
Oh,
defense,
I don't
but
mean it as an attack. I'm asking
no,
if I'm
no.
misunderstanding it. Like, because it seems to me,
Hmm.
and I didn't mean to interrupt you. I apologize for that, but it seems to
Hmm.
me that he's saying, hey, we need time to think. We need, and that has to be rooted in the ordinary because, and I feel like he's saying it has to be rooted in the ordinary because our lives can't be predicated upon some extraordinary
Absolutely.
happening. The value has
Well
to be
said.
rooted.
Well, I want to emphasize what you just said.
Yeah,
That was very well put. That he is insisting that these alternative practices are rooted in the ordinary because we don't have time. Did you say that? That's really well put. We literally don't have time to wait for the extraordinary. We
right.
have to work with it. But well, go ahead and finish your
No,
thought,
no, I'm
and then
done. I'm done.
um, I just wanted to, I don't feel that is you were sort of implying um that that it seems rhetorical, that closing gesture is just rhetorical,
Yeah,
or
yeah.
largely rhetorical. I think that actually what I wanted to turn to, and I kind of want to close to it, was something else you read, because I actually like the passage you read, his quote unquote homely quotidian examples. And I thought, I'm just going to pick one of them. I'm going to return. This is something from what you read. And I have to say, I'm very impressed with this. Maybe I'm over impressed with this. But it's kind of a throwaway line. When he's talking about, I'm returning to the passage you read, 55. He has that list of, right now we're trying to disintoxicate ourselves.
Okay. Yeah, yeah.
That's the goal of it. And he mentions the struggle to ban smoking in enclosed public places. He gives all these examples. I just want to pick this one where he talks about the establishment, I'll stop right here. I'll try and pick the most compact one, but I'm very impressed with it. The establishment of new regimes of healthy eating. When you think about it, diet is the perfect example of a practice of attention. You can't get more quotidian because you have to eat every day. You can't get more unextraordinary in one sense because you have to eat every day.
Right.
But I think it's a great example of the paradox, because in the middle of this daily effing boring, mundane, whatever you call it, practice, he's saying, well, if you're doing that consciously, if you're thinking about what you're consuming, quite literally, if that affects your buying practices as well as your physical regimen, then that ordinary thing becomes extraordinary. And it's so I like it because it's literally a homely, quotidian, boring, even example. It's not showy, but I think that's what he's talking about. But he's saying, and note that paragraph you read, there's a lot of stuff there, right? And so he's inviting us to say that, well, I don't think he feels, I'm sure that if I went back to him and said, well, I read you, Dr. Steigler. I now learned that I can, go on a diet and I will fix the pharmakon.
Well,
obviously he wouldn't say that. What he's impressed with are the multiplicity of practices, right?
Right. Well, you don't fix the pharmakon because the pharmakon's not broken, right?
Very well put. Exactly.
It's a state of relations. I think that your point is really that's a really, really sharp insight, though, because again, you don't fix it. The goal
You're not
here,
fixing it, and
the goal here is to
absolutely
spot opportunities to change the nature of your relation, and I guess the hope, right? And this goes really back to the conversations that
you say it beautifully
we've been having. The hope is that because the pharmakon and pharmaca in general is all relational, that you now find a way to start introducing cures.
Let's stop while we're ahead.
I'm totally okay with that. Barry, this was I gotta tell you, I'm not gonna jump back in.
I was joking. I mean, do you
no,
I don't think it's, in other words, I think those examples, they sound homely, but I think they keep that last paragraph from just being merely rhetorical fluff.
Yes.
I think he is giving us some substance,
Yeah, I mean, I think that this was in a way, I'm still very frustrated because I just don't care for the way that this is written. But I do really like the way that the pieces come together. I mean, I think that this is I can't believe I'm saying this because, again, I struggled with it. But in a way, I think the discussion that we've had tonight really sort of renders this as a fairly lucid argument about, hey,
well, it's there's a through line in this chapter.
Yeah, and that through line is really, really interesting. This idea about attention, I think. I mean, I think that the Simone Weil being present in here is not a surprise, and I think it's a very helpful little insertion.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you.
Thank you for a great conversation, Michael. I look forward to next time.
Absolutely, Barry. Have a good one.
You take care.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to the Critical Media Studies podcast. To find out more about the show, check out our webpage at criticalmediastudiespodcast.com.